Joining me now, Mike Lee from Utah, a constitutional lawyer himself and a fellow who knows a thing or two about arguing in front of the Supreme Court. He clerked for Samuel Alito. So you were in this hearing today, 2 hours of hearings. What did you make of what you heard?
First of all, it was significant that there were 2 hours of argument. That's almost unprecedented. It's certainly unprecedented in recent years to have a 6-hour argument, as we will between the 3 days. But today what I saw was a lot of skepticism from 5 justices that have indicated in the past, to one degree or another, they believe in structural federalism. The limits are on federal power. In particular, I was watching Justice Anthony Kennedy, widely believed to be the swing vote, and I saw a lot of skepticism from him.
He made a lot of statements and a lot of questions that seemed to demonstrate his own questions about this. I was really surprised at the language he used, how he seemed to show his hand. Do you think that Obamacare supporters are now up against it? Do you think it's possible the Supreme Court will overturn the individual mandate? I
think it's not only possible. I think, based on what I saw today, it's likely. A lot of my reason for saying that has to do with not just the questions asked by Justice Kennedy, but also his cadence, his intonation, his body language, his facial expressions, while asking the question and in response to the answers he receives to his questions. They indicated a high degree of skepticism about Congress's authority to enact the individual mandate.
Now, did you see that kind of skepticism from anybody else?
Absolutely. I saw it from the Chief Justice Roberts. I saw it from Justice Scalia. I saw it from Justice Alito. Justice Thomas, of course, did not ask questions, and that's his practice. But we know from Justice Thomas, based on his writings, where he's going to stand on this. It would be shocking to all of us if he reached any other conclusion than that this is unconstitutional.
And, of course, the liberals on the court falling on the other side. There were no surprises there, right?
None whatsoever. It was quite apparent to me that Justice Ginsburg, Justice Breyer, Justice Kagan, and Justice Sotomayor are going to vote to uphold the constitutionality of this act.
You know, it's so interesting to me that you clerked with a Supreme Court justice. You really have an insider's view of how this all works. You know, they're not going to make a ruling till June. That's a long time. Could they change their minds in between? What do you see as the way these things typically play out?
Well, the way it normally works is the Friday following oral argument, presumably this Friday, the justices will meet in their conference room, just the 9 justices, no law clerks, no secretaries, anyone else. They'll vote in order of seniority, with the Chief Justice voting first and the most junior justice voting last, and they'll make a preliminary decision. But the die isn't cast until the opinions are actually issued and the justices announce which opinions they're joining, which will happen by the end of June. It's actually a relatively short turnaround time for a decision of this magnitude and of this importance.
I'm going to tell you, most of the predictions I saw were that the Supreme Court was leaning the other way, and that, in fact, it would be easy for the president and his representatives to actually turn some of these conservative justices. Were you surprised by this?
I wasn't. I was predicting that there might be some indications of this. I underestimated the extent to which I would feel the way I now feel, but I predicted to some extent this could go this way. A lot of people have made the mistaken conclusion that because precedent dating back to 1937 has been pretty permissive under the Commerce Clause, that Congress may do anything. And of course, that isn't true. If there's one thing the entire founding generation agreed upon, it's that Congress's powers were few and defined. That's what we're dealing with in this case. If the individual mandate is somehow constitutional, there's nothing left to the concept of Congress having only limited powers.
Interesting. One of the justices today saying, if you can do this, then you can tell me what cell phone to buy or to buy a cell phone to get emergency care, which I thought was very interesting. I want to turn to Mitt Romney for just a second here, because you have endorsed him, as I understand. And of course, Romney, you know, the author of Romney Care, big question about if he becomes a standard bearer for Republicans, what is that going to mean come the fall? And of course, now we're seeing, an interesting conversation going on about Obamacare. What is that going to mean for the faithful, for the GOP faithful, many of whom are not in love with this single-payer system that's being promoted here?
This shouldn't be an issue for Romney. Look, there is a world of difference between states and what they have the power to do, and Congress and what it has the power to do. Decisions like these, gut-wrenching, difficult decisions about health care reform, are made by states. They ought to be made by states. It's the states that license doctors and nurses and hospitals and clinics. It's the states that license and regulate health insurance companies. It's the states that come up with the system of tort laws that governs medical malpractice lawsuits. So states control all these drivers of health care costs. It's entirely appropriate for states to engage in more comprehensive types of reform. Now, a state like mine, Utah, isn't going to make the same decisions that a state like Massachusetts or Vermont might make, and thank heaven for that. But there is a fundamental difference between what happens when a state does this as compared to when Congress does it. That's what this case was about today, and that's why the Obama administration, I predict, is going to suffer a defeat in this case.
It's fascinating and so interesting to hear what you have to say, having been there, knowing the players so well. Thank you so much, Senator. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.